Welcome back, everyone. I think we're going to get started again. I just want to make a couple more little technical announcements. And one of those is that at the conclusion of today's session, all of the lectures... Am I on now? There, right, good. Okay, I'll start that over. Apologies to those who are remote. At the end of this session today, all of the lectures so far, all 4 sessions, will be available on YouTube together with the study guides. And if you want to get to them, you can find them by going to the Synod website. There's a button for the cross at the center, and you click on that and you can follow it through. So these are all still there. You can go back and hear things again, or if there's something you've missed, you can go back and follow that. And they will stay up indefinitely. I might try to do a slightly more polished version of them at some point, but as long as people can get to them, I think that's the key thing. So if this is something you think that others in your congregation might enjoy, and you'd like to do it as a congregational activity, you can always divide these 4 sessions into half sessions, because each of the lectures is divided in half. So that gives you about a half an hour's worth of lecture and some questions to talk about. I'm grateful to those of you who came to be with us today in the room. This is the largest crowd yet. Every chair is full, and that's very exciting. It's also much more fun for me to have a live studio audience. For those of you who are watching this remotely, that is not canned laughter. They really are enjoying themselves. So, in this second part of today's reflection on the Christian life from Lutheran perspective, I want to go a little deeper into the question of what it means to love our neighbor. Because that, in the end, is the most important aspect of this. And to do that, to really reflect on that, and it's not only the most important, it's the most difficult of the challenges of Christian life, is to love our neighbors as ourselves. What is it that we owe our neighbor anyway? And in fact, when you get down to it, who is our neighbor? These are the questions that we really need to have some answers for. Our simple approach would be, and this is the way I like to start, is that our individual responsibility for our neighbor reaches as far as our agency does. That is to say, we bear responsibility everywhere we can make a difference, where we can have some impact. Which is a lot of places, if you begin to think about it. Because we all live, even as individuals, within concentric circles of relationship, with ourselves maybe in the middle, and our homes and families gathered around us, our work or our school, our neighborhood, our community, our congregation, our nation, the world. Larger and larger circles that ripple out from us in the middle. And each of them in turn seems more remote, and the impact that we might have within each of these expanding circles might be less. But we're still connected to them. And we are all connected to everything through God, who is the source and end of all that is. Looked at from the standpoint of modern sociology or political science, the world that Martin Luther lived in was small and narrow. Ours, in contrast, is wide and broad. For Luther, there were really 3 realms of individual life, areas in which humans, societal structures in which humans were embedded and of which they were a part. For Luther, and he talks about this in the Catechism in part, are the family, the church church community, the community of believers within the village or the town, and then the government, the political structure of which we are a part. Luther calls these three regiments, regimente. We don't really have an English word for a regiment, but it means like an order of structure, a system, an organizational reality, family, church, and government. And most broadly, he would understand God as being at work within those, not just within us, but also within those existing human structures. This is sometimes called Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, that God works in two different ways at the same time. God works in us, in our hearts through faith. God's message of love and salvation in the gospel frees and liberates us to service. But God also works through the structures of society around us, calling us into fellowship with one another and into service to each other. And that in some ways, God is active in both realms. That's a complicated idea, and I'm not going to do too much more with it today. I just want to put it out there for the sake of the experts who are listening to make sure it was there. I don't think that it has a lot of traction in our modern way of looking at the world. And Luther's way of understanding the way social organization worked in his own time was, by our standard, very old-fashioned and narrow and hierarchical. He really believed that the principal relationship between an inferior and a superior person, that is, these are not the quality of the person, but the position in society that they hold, was one of obedience and responsibility. Luther didn't have a lot of room for negotiations among people about what the best thing would be. He believed that some were put into the world to rule over others, and that the people who were to be ruled over owed the rulers obedience. And to fail to give it was a violation of the order of things that had been set in motion by God. We don't need to go there in too much detail, because that's not the way we see the world. That's not the way anyone has seen the world at least in the Western world since the Enlightenment, where we understand ourselves as being participants in systems and structures. We may not all have the same authority or the same powers or the same influence, but we are all part of things, and that there is a relationship that goes beyond obedience that connects us all together. We don't believe in a top-down system. Luther really did. In the economy, as he would call it, in the structure of the family, the father had an absolute rule. Parallel to that, in the structure of the church, the pastor had that authority. Of course, in Luther's day, this would also be assumed to be a male. And then in the governmental structure, which is in some ways the exception, the ruler also most likely was a male. Not in every single case, but certainly in Germany, there were rules that made it hard for women to be rulers. So the king or the local duke or prince was a male as well. And so these assumptions about the order of creation, the structure of society, that for Luther were just part of the air that he breathed and the water that he drank, these are foreign to us today. And so you can't just take Luther's social ethic and pull it across the 450 years to today. Because we have so much greater freedom and so much greater agency than our spiritual ancestors did, but we still understand ourselves as being put into a world, into a context by God that we are responsible for and have to relate to. We see our relationships as more complicated than that. And so the purpose in part of this lecture is to talk about the complexity of community and the fact that we are, as believers embedded in communities of faith, we are as citizens embedded in systems of political structure that for which we have responsibility because we also have agency. Agency and responsibility are, in Luther's view, the poles of moral life. As I said before, agency is the freedom to act, to influence your own life, the life of others, and the world around you. Responsibility, on the other side, is the moral obligation to use your agency in a way that is maximally helpful and supportive of others. And today I would add, of creation as well. The idea of agency is an abstract one. It's useful because of that, but it has its limits, both internal and external, because we actually are not autonomous, unlimited beings. We are self-limiting in the ability of our own imaginations to encompass the things around us. We're also, of course, embedded in a society and in a community, and we have conventions of behavior and life together that provide external rules for our conduct that give us some limits. We also have the capacity, and this is a really complicated idea, the capacity to surrender part of our agency to other people in forms of social organization that we participate, like government. We don't claim the right to be the kings of each of our own domains, because we know how that would work, how badly that would work. And so we confer to others the power to use agency on our behalf for the sake of our safety and our well-being, from the simple matter of having traffic laws to the whole police power of the state, and the fact that the government can go to war on our behalf, regardless of how we feel about the particular issues of the moment. We can also give away our agency in unproductive ways by being passive when we could be active, by not using the agency we have, by disengaging from the society around us. And we can disengage, I think, both for good reasons sometimes, which is sometimes to protest the way things are, by refusing to take part in some aspects of it. And we can also give away our agency fruitlessly, I believe, by just feeling hopeless about things and deciding not to participate any longer. Those people who, you all know somebody who's probably told you that they don't vote because it doesn't matter. That's what I think of as a bad surrender of agency. In the world in which we live, with a lot of political polarization and blaming, a lot of this has to do with our differing understandings of agency and responsibility. I get a lot of people, you'd be surprised how many people come to me and say, why aren't you doing something about X? What X is depends on the week. And I always hear this as a cry from this person that X is becoming unbearable to them. And they're trying to figure out how to find help in doing something about it. And because I am a person who has some status, I'm the natural person to ask. It's often put in this personal way, what are you doing about it? But I interpret it as being a question of what can we do about this? At least that's the way I reflect it back to them. And I ask, what does it feel like to be in this situation? What is it that is causing the anxiety? And what agency can we apply to it in this particular case? One of the things that we often do is we think that other people's agency is greater than our own. And I think that's a place where Americans have a lot of opportunity to practice agency because of our participatory democracy. I would assume that everyone in this room has been registered to vote and has voted at least at some point in their lives. How many of you are proud of voting at every possible opportunity? A handful. Southern California and Los Angeles and the school district give us many opportunities, some of which we are more grateful for than others. But in our household too, an opportunity to vote that is not taken seems like abdication of responsibility, even though, as is sometimes the case, we're not 100% sure what we really think about the issue at hand. Agency and responsibility are also connected to our understanding of the world around us. So we can actually gain agency by informing ourselves about issues, about the context in which we live, by trying to distinguish between sources of information that we find reliable because we trust where they get their facts and how they use them, because they have a track record of accuracy. I think also if we are not discriminating about what we hear and accept as true that others tell us, we actually give agency away because we allow others to decide for us what is true and how we can use our agency. It may seem a little bit abstract to you, but I think it's important because we can't simply return to the kind of obedience paradigm that Luther had. In our modern age, we are both part of the problem and part of the solution at the same time. And where we stand under God as Christians, reacting to the world around us, has both elements of our faith and of our limitation. That we have agency, I think, as Christians, because God has given us the ability to make distinctions within our world for good and evil, has given us a chance, given us the power to make reasoned choices, and then has given us the beacon light of Jesus Christ, the promise of salvation that reassures us that even our mistakes are not eternal, that God has a larger picture than we can envision of what the world is and what it will mean. That doesn't absolve us from responsibility. As many Christians for many generations thought that the world was eternal and humans were temporal, and that all we needed to do was struggle by, and it didn't matter what we did to the forests and to the air and to the water, that it would always be there for us. I think we're discovering the limits of that there was a kind of human arrogance in that, or a sense that God would just come and punish us all and reward us all before the end, before we could ruin the world. Well, it hasn't happened like that. And we might find out a whole different kind of punishment by ruining the world first. In any event, the point is that we have been given agency by God. God makes us thinking creatures with abilities to react and make a difference. And as people who are citizens of an extraordinarily rich and powerful nation, even if it feels threatened and beset a bit at the moment and somewhat polarized, we have incredible agency within the wider world in which we live to make a difference. And with that comes proportionate responsibility. And I think our faithful response to God requires us as individuals, as Americans, as Californians, to come to terms with our agency and our responsibility, and to do what we can. You're not going to hear a partisan argument from me on this, although I think it could go that way. It certainly could go that way at the drop of a hat in many forums all the time. What I want to lift up is a responsibility and agency that everybody holds, regardless of their political persuasion. And that if we can figure out ways to talk about this agency and responsibility that we share, I think we could get to a deeper point of understanding about our dependence on the world around us in ways that could lift us above the squabbling about political points that people are making nowadays. That was a bit of a tangent. I really didn't intend to go there. But it does pertain to my larger point that part of the challenge for us is to see ourselves as being made in God's image. You know, there's a complicated way in which the scriptures talk about us being made in the image and likeness of God. That doesn't mean that God is somehow just us projected large unto the heavens, but that there is something in us that God wants to use to help us understand how God is connected to us. And I think that is seeing God in each other. That we are part of a created order. That we are part of something in which not every part is human. Any of you who have a heart for wildlife or endangered species or even cute fuzzy creatures will know how intensely our feelings are awakened by the mistreatment of an animal. And how sometimes it's ironic to me that it's easier for us to dehumanize other humans than it is to dehumanize puppies and kittens. We want them so badly. And that the challenge for us is to see things humanly without over-humanizing them. We humans have a key and decisive role in the world. We're part of a created order. We have incredible agency. And technology and communications have amplified our agency to a new high level. So that now a single person with a computer can cause no end of trouble in the world. From the darkness of their lonely apartment can cause hate to multiply and be amplified and echo around the world. And that's a kind of agency too, really horrifying kind in some ways, especially when it comes with a total lack of responsibility that should keep a sane person from wanting to engage in that kind of hate speech. So we have social agency, we have economic agency, we have environmental agency, and they're all connected together. What's changed for us, and what's changed so much since Luther's time, is that we also have an incredible sense of diversity in our world. We can't take our uniformity or our unity for granted. In a homogeneous society, the same expectations can be made for everyone. One of the simple ideas for which some people have nostalgia is for a world in which everybody agreed, because we were all the same, presumably of a single faith and of a single race and a single economic level. That never actually existed in this country, but there are places even now where you can get to something sort of like that in a particular neighborhood, usually a neighborhood with a gate. But a place in any event where in the great sorting of people that we're seeing, demographic reality of today's America, is that people are more likely than at any point in our history to live in places where the people next door and next door to them are just like them than ever before. This has to do with prosperity, because the better off you are, the more likely you live in a community like that, because you can afford to join it. We know all about that in Southern California. The moving up into a larger, more expensive home is possible through greater economic prosperity. And those who don't have that stay in the neighborhoods where they have been, even though those, in contrast, often become more different than they were in the past. This has presented some interesting demographic challenges for us as a church, as you know, especially those of you who go to a church that's reasonably close to where you have lived for many years, and perhaps went there from the beginning because of its proximity to your home, That's a challenge for our congregations on many different levels. But it's also a challenge for us as people in a community that is more diverse than any of us bargained for in some ways. Even if you understand diversity as a form of enrichment, and it's hard sometimes to do that, although I think it is in many ways an enrichment. Even if you can see it in those terms, it's still more complicated to negotiate difference than it is to swim in a pool of people of the same kind. And when we can no longer make assumptions about what our neighbors might think about one thing or another, it makes us uncertain and uneasy about how well we really know them, about how well we can work with them. And in some ways, I think it makes it harder to love them. And when I talk about loving your neighbor, I'm not talking about some kind of sappy, sentimental Hallmark card kind of life. It's harder to see them as being like you, as being people to the same degree that you are, if you don't know anything about them, because you can't understand what they're saying, or because they live according to a faith that is foreign to yours, or you simply never see them because they keep to themselves, afraid perhaps of you. And in this world, it's much easier to cocoon and become isolated in our own point of view. There are, I would imagine, even in this room, a few people for whom the reporters on a particular cable news channel, and I don't mean one in particular, I can think of several candidates, are closer to you in your sense of what it means to be a citizen today than some people you're related to. At least I know that's true for me. And when we can no longer assume that even people we know are where we are on lots of things, it becomes much harder to talk about anything. This is why I think some of the sort of hot button moral issues of the day, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but things like abortion and gay marriage become symbols for a different kind of failure to understand. A sense that the world has simply gone in a place it shouldn't have gone, and that somebody's responsible for that, but we're not quite sure who. It's those others. And or that a society that was going in the right direction is being pulled back off of it by people. We don't know quite who, but we know we don't like the effects of it. I mean, I'm not arguing for one position or the other, but to say that what happens as a consequence is a greater level of fear, a greater level of mistrust. And it becomes harder to talk about everything. Especially if we have taken for granted that there was only one Christian way of looking at things, when we suddenly discover that there isn't. That can be very difficult for people. I can't tell you how many times I have had in my long life have had a discussion with somebody who said, well, my Bible says. and there's just nowhere you can go with that. And I've given up trying. There's just so much that's wrong with that, although it makes me want to do some Bible checking. If everyone's Bible is so idiosyncratic, there must be some interesting things out there. But to build one's Christianity on narrow propositions of truth is to build it in a very weak way that is I think not lasting and difficult. And I think part of the answer for us as Christians, especially in the matrix of other Christians who are not like us, is not to assume that every question has a clear Christian answer that everyone knows or agrees to, but to fall back on the fact that we're human together, and that every question, even if it doesn't have a clear answer, at least has human angles of approach that we can try to share, even if we don't end up in the same place. I think that it's in some ways extraordinarily challenging for us to exercise neighbor love in a world of unforeseen consequences and uncertain outcomes, a world that's as complicated as ours. We understand and we criticize economic colonialism when we see that the exploitation of a particular place or a particular group of people is happening to the benefit of others. We can deplore that. But we also participate in it, sometimes very indirectly. And the effects of pollution don't stop at national borders. That anywhere in the world where the earth is being destroyed for the profit of a few is hurting everybody in the long term, although it may be hurting the locals more or quicker or in a particular way that isn't hurting the rest of us. And the abstract version of this is social media, where a single idea or opinion in a vast social media network, a universe, without any natural brakes on it, and with natural amplifiers like the mechanical ways in which opinions can get repeated by those who are skilled at manipulating them, this pushes us also toward a kind of chaotic world and threatens and shakes our hold on behavioral norms and on a willingness to engage with strangers and to feel like we have any sense of the moral assumptions of other people. And I know this sounds really relentlessly bleak, but I don't mean it that way, because I think that wrestling with the enormity of it is part of the challenge. That we can say some things for sure. And one of them is that Christian social ethics, a Christian social ethics that begins in the idea of the love of God and love of neighbor, has to be cooperative and not competitive. I can't see any way, certainly there's none that Martin Luther would endorse, for claiming that systems of social or economic organization that inevitably end up with winners and losers can have any justification from a Christian standpoint. Luther was extraordinarily what we would say today, anti-business, because he believed that to take more than a fair return on a product was to take advantage of one's neighbor's weakness. Now, what a fair return is, of course, is the sticking point. And even in Luther's day, nobody really could say how much you could add to the price of a turnip to make it worth the farmer's work, the wagoneer's labor to take it to town, and the market stall owner's efforts to shout turnips at the top of their lungs until somebody came to buy it. How much of a share does each one of those people deserve in the value of a turnip? It's a real question, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about turnips or bond securities. Who is it who is benefiting from the sale and resale of items? Luther would say that at every transactional level, something is lost. That is, the greater the likelihood that the person who is the purchaser is being taken advantage of by the process. So obviously, digging up your own darn turnip and cooking it yourself was the best way, because there was no middleman. But even Luther didn't grow turnips. Mrs. Luther did, in fact, and he and his family participated in the kind of rudimentary free enterprise system of the time. But what I just want to say that Luther believed to the end of his life that to charge interest on a loan was a sin. It was a way for a wealthy person to take advantage of a poor person. That the Christian form of lending was to let one's money be used freely by someone else, and with the risk, of course, falling on the borrower. And that it would be then connected by a mutual regard and neighbor love, and that the whole community would benefit from that. I don't think anyone could ever have imagined basing an economic system on that kind of Christian altruism. But it does get at the heart of a dilemma that we have in our highly globalized neoliberal economic system is that we are very good at shifting around the disadvantages of globalism while concentrating its benefits with a few people. That we spread out the risk and we concentrate the gain. The great gulf between the rich and the poor in the Western world is a symptom of that. And I don't see how can be reconciled with Christianity. You can't simply tame it into a Christian mold. And I think that ever since the failure of the Calvinist experiment, we no longer see material prosperity as a sign of God's favor. That Lutherans have never been given to that particular form of heresy, but we have danced around its edges for a long time to think that God rewards those who are most industrious, God rewards those who work the hardest with the greatest return. In fact, God usually, at least the system, rewards those who have the greatest advantages and the greatest agency to manipulate them. And God is nowhere in the equation. So I'm going to posit for us today, before we go, that there might be some new, more Lutheran ways of looking at these things. That the old idea of the earth as having been given to humans to dominate could be replaced by a new understanding of that human dominion as involving human responsibility for creation, where the responsibility follows the agency. That we stop thinking, to the degree that it fuels our waste of the earth or our destruction of the environment, we stop thinking about human life as being a temporary one, sandwiched between the days of creation and the days of the second coming, and instead live on the earth as though God intended for it to be eternal. I think that would be a much more constructive way to approach it. And in fact, we don't know that not to be true, because the promise of a new heaven and a new earth doesn't necessarily replace the one we have, but repopulates it and reorganizes it in a new way. We may be actually intended to live on this earth forever, in whatever eternal form we are to take before the throne of God. It might actually be right here. So it will be a grave disappointment to us if we have destroyed it in anticipation. One of the shifts that's actually happening in our church history and our understanding of ourselves is that we have reevaluated this responsibility for the world around us. That we see the second coming as not being just about a liberation from a destroyed world, to being an adaptation to one in which we will live more gently and more lovingly. And that we don't see the world as a place to be conquered by ourselves, but as a place in which we live together with others. I think that the ultimate answer to the question of what is a Christian life has to lie in the fact that it needs to be generous in its self-understanding. It needs to be oriented toward the other. I think to live a life like that requires greater bravery and courage than to live a life that hedges its bets and that protects itself. I think God calls us not to live safely, but fearlessly, and calls on us to try to make the changes that we can. Gives us the agency to make a difference, even if that is a small dose. Even if we only have a teaspoon of agency, we at least can make that much difference. To try to live as Jesus lived for us, caring for those around him, impatient with half-truth and halfway love that is ultimately self-serving, always pointing toward God, the one who made us all and who judges us all. The challenge for us is to live in some way as fully as we can with what God has given us right now, and making as much difference for good as we can in the place that we have been given to live. And of course, I do believe that our faith is a faith of hope. Trusting in God's mercy, knowing that God's mercy is greater than our imperfection, and knowing that God's love is everlasting. Knowing all that, the Christian life is to do the best we can. Thank you for listening, and God bless you all. I am grateful. If there are questions, further discussion, we're happy to engage in it for a few minutes. For those of you who are still on the line, hang with us. Yes, sir.
What about the misapplication of agency and our failures of responsibility? Where and what is the accountability?
Well, I do think the question is, what about failures of agency and failures of responsibility, and what is the accountability? I think in terms of the way we manage our society and the earth, the accountability is built in the sense that we inevitably end up harming ourselves by what we have done. So that there's a practical level of accountability in the working out of our decisions. From the divine standpoint, we have not been given a clear picture of how God feels about the destruction of the earth. We can posit that by working backwards from our failure to love one another. And if that is the kind of moral failure we believe it is because of Jesus, then I think we could extrapolate from that our failure to love the world that God has made might also be a source of judgment for us. But I don't think, for the most part, we worry as much, or need worry as much, about an ultimate judgment as we do about the consequences of our acts for each other and for our descendants. Because the people we hurt are our great-grandchildren. And we're accountable to them, even though we're not around. We won't be around to hear their complaints. So I think there's some accountability built in this, to the degree that the creation as we know it on earth is a closed system. It does have a way of punishing us. I wish somehow that we had understood the creation story in Genesis more as a kind of manifesto of responsibility than as a story of our independence and failure to appreciate that independence. Maybe a little less morally and a little more ecologically. But people are doing that. I'm not one of the theologians who has done creative work in that field, but we have some around us right here in California. That Cynthia Molavita at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, Lisa Dayhill here at California Lutheran University, and many others have really moved the ELCA and its theology into a place of prominence in thinking about these questions. I'm still kind of stuck in the moral theology of the late Middle Ages. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the last question about the Christian way to vote. I would surmise from the points that you mentioned that Christians should always vote. And, in our increasingly diverse definition of Christianity, perhaps bookend by fundamentalist Orthodox and hopefully Southern California ELCA, and perhaps there's a correlation between partisan lines on those ends, but to stay away from that, how do you categorize a Christian way to vote, given that spectrum is becoming broader and more diverse?
The question was how I would characterize a Christian way to vote, as articulated in one of the sentences, the questions on the study sheet. That was intentionally provocative. And the answer may be there is no consistent Christian way to vote. And I do think that there might even be circumstances in which the Christian option would be not to vote. If you were called upon to participate in a system that was rigged, in your view, was rigged in such a way that no good could come of it, that a better, clearer statement would be made by refusal to participate, then I could justify failure to vote. I actually don't see that as a real likelihood in our own system right now. It still seems to me useful to vote. But for example, if the only choice was to vote for a single party, as it is in some, has been in some systems and countries in the past, or a set of parties, all of whom have been carefully groomed to have the same point of view, so there isn't any genuine choice, then actually showing, as happens in Russia, low voter turnout is about the only way to vote no. So there, I think, could be an argument for that. Anyway, I think the question is, how should this Christian vote? This Christian, that Christian? How should you use your agency and your understanding in the most responsible possible way to vote in a way that benefits your neighbor as much as it does you? That's not an impossible thing to ask, although it takes a lot of thought. And sometimes who gets benefited is not at all clear on the face of it. We have a system, a political system that is so corrupted by the impact of money that it often is very skilled at concealing who the real beneficiaries of proposals are. The follow the money principle is a pretty good one, I think, and almost no matter what your political opinions are, you will get more quickly to who benefits by seeing where the funding comes from than in any other way. And that's something Luther couldn't have imagined. And it's just a whole different way of organizing reality than he would ever have been able to think of. And it's in some ways more nefarious because it's easier to hide within it. And the challenge for me is not that there is evil in the world, it's that it dresses itself as good. Sorry, that wasn't an easy answer. Thank you for wrestling with. Yes, sorry. That's right.
Yeah, just if you could elaborate on love your enemy.
Huh?
Part of also
Yeah, you notice I didn't say that. I didn't bring up love your enemy. That's the question. What about love your enemy? I think what Jesus is trying to tell, I mean, what we're trying to be told in this is that there is nobody who's not our neighbor. That in fact, that if we move people in our minds out of the category of neighbor and into the category of enemy, we give away our responsibility for them. And I think we are really in some ways not expected to have a warm and fuzzy feeling about people who mean us harm, but to understand that we are still all in this together, whether we're working toward the same end or not, and that we still have to live on Earth, and that we have to figure out ways to do that. If it were possible to live in harmony with other human beings, and there were some easy recipe for how to structure community so that would happen, we'd have done it by now. We've had, millennia of practice, and even the most utopian experiments in social organization have tended to fail in the end because of people's anxiety and fear and selfishness. So I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Pogo comic strip, but there's the famous line where the main character says, "We have met the enemy and he is us." And in some ways, love your enemy is a little bit like love yourself, in a sense, because we aren't always exactly clear who the friends and who the enemies are. And we can all know that we can be our own worst enemies at times. Now, I do think that all of this is tempered by our immediate experience and need. I'm at the moment deep in one of the thickest books I've ever read, although it reads very fast. It's like this thick. That is a biography of General Grant in the Civil War, and I've just gotten about halfway through. I'm up to the surrender of Vicksburg, and it's made me think a lot about war and about enemies and how people who are related to each other and speak the same language and just end up on different sides of a really important issue end up killing one another and causing great destruction in the name of an abstract ideal. And it is both terrifying and inspiring at the same time because it's so familiar. It feels like the world in which we live. in which the division between those people who say it can't possibly be this way and the people who say it absolutely must be this way is so deep that there's no bridging. And it's helped me reflect on when our friends are our enemies and when our enemies are our friends, and how we distinguish, and then how we can manage somehow to come back after that and be friends and relatives again. One of the things that strikes me in the book is that because these are all Americans, most of whom were not familiar with being in a war, when an army would roll through a place conquering a countryside, it wouldn't be long before the locals were trying to sell them chickens. I mean, that there's something basic about our need to get along on a micro level that was even able to negotiate the complexity of being bitterly at odds with each other as a nation. And at least I found this book a little reassuring, because it reminds me how much worse things could be than they are right now. And it also has moments of being very inspiring as well. Good. Well, thank you again for your attention, for being with us at this, and I hope we'll do it again next year in some way.